Don't miss the rest of this story. Subscribe now to join the voices that still believe leadership can be built on dignity, not drama. His boots are dusty. His uniform is the same one he wore when bullets were flying, not when cameras were rolling. He doesn't speak in poetry or shout into microphones, yet millions lean in when he talks. In a continent where power often arrives with velvet gloves and leaves behind broken promises, one man walks differently, not with pride, but with purpose. His name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and if you've never heard of him, perhaps it's because he never asked to be seen. But in the silence of his walk, in the simplicity of his choices, lies a kind of leadership that speaks directly to the heart, especially the hearts of those who've watched too many decades pass with too little change. Across Africa, elders remember what was promised and never delivered. They've seen palaces rise and people fall. They know when a man is speaking truth or simply repeating what the last one said. Captain Traoré didn't come with declarations. He came with discipline. And in the twilight of many elders' lives, he's offering something rare, not spectacle, but service. When he refused the presidential salary, some laughed. They said it was for show. But the old women selling tomatoes in Ouagadougou markets didn't laugh. They wept. They knew what it meant to have a leader who'd rather build a school than redecorate an office. Traoré's choices weren't just frugal, they were ancestral. Elders across villages whispered his name not because he was loud, but because he reminded them of a time when leaders ate after everyone else had eaten. When he walked into the Russia-Africa Summit in July 2023, he didn't blend in. He disrupted. A room full of designer suits and gold-rimmed confidence stood still as he entered in combat fatigues. Red beret pulled tight, hands calloused, eyes unblinking. He didn't speak for applause. He challenged, and what he said wasn't rehearsed, it was remembered. Because old souls recognize the weight of a simple truth. True power doesn't announce itself, it just acts. He told them, stop being puppets, start acting sovereign. In that moment, elders across the continent nodded silently, as if their youth had briefly returned through his voice. Leadership, they had said, was once sacred. And maybe, just maybe, it still could be. They say time teaches, but not everyone listens. Older generations have watched promises rot under the sun, watched politicians arrive with music and leave with silence. But this time, something is different. Traoré didn't ride into power on chance or billboards. He walked in quietly, almost reluctantly. And yet what followed was louder than any anthem. In September 2022, when he took control of Burkina Faso, he didn't storm the palace gates with ego. He stepped into the role like a soldier reporting for duty, not to rule, but to repair. And elders noticed it. They noticed when he refused the presidential palace, saying, I am to have a bed. Let the money go to the soldiers in the schools. They noticed when he declined a $2,000 salary to keep his captain's $300 paycheck. They noticed because their generation understands the value of restraint. They remember when food was shared, not stolen, when titles came after trust, not before. They saw in Traoré not a young man playing a part, but an old soul living his truth. And when he cut ministers' salaries, redirected funds to hospitals, and eliminated luxury cars, the elderly clapped softly, not with excitement, but with relief. Relief that finally someone understood that dignity doesn't come from suits or sirens. It comes from service. Traoré didn't build a personality cult. He built policy. And while critics scoffed and elites sulked, grandmothers across dusty towns whispered to grandchildren, watch him closely. This one is different. Because they know when a man refuses comfort to give others peace, he's not acting. That's legacy in motion. So if you're watching and you've seen leaders fail your parents, fail your children, tell us in the comments what kind of leader you still believe in. We're listening, and we're not alone. He didn't ask for the cameras. He didn't send invitations to journalists. But still, the stories came, not from press briefings, but from village mouths and hospital corridors. A nurse in Fada told of the day Traoré arrived unannounced to inspect medicine stock. He didn't come with security detail or TV crews. He came with questions. Real ones. What do you need to stay open another week? When she answered soap, batteries, security, those things arrived the next morning. Not as charity, but as policy. An old man in Banfora who had lost 2 sons to war wept when the captain visited his home quietly at dawn, laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "You are not forgotten." That man hadn't cried in years, but that day he wept like a boy, not because someone died, but because someone finally remembered. Traore doesn't do this for applause. He does it because that's how he was raised. Orphaned young, hardened early, he knows that real leadership is not a stage, it's a weight you carry. And maybe that's why older people feel something stir when he speaks. They've seen the shows before. They've seen men with rehearsed smiles and clever slogans. But Traore speaks like someone who's buried friends and saluted ghosts. He walks like someone who knows the price of silence. And when he visits border towns alone without fanfare, elders notice. They notice because that's what real leaders used to do before they became too important to kneel in the dust. Before they needed photo ops to prove presence, Traore proves it in silence, in grit, in early mornings and sleepless nights. Have you ever known a leader like that? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what dignity means to you. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes one honest action speaks more than 1,000 speeches. It wasn't the medals or titles that moved people. It was the fact that he never asked for them. When Captain Traoré led one of the most disciplined and bloodless coups in Africa's recent history, he didn't decorate himself with victory. He didn't print his face on posters or demand new anthems. He didn't even reshuffle the cabinet for loyalty. His first act wasn't political. It was personal. He visited a hospital near a conflict zone, not to pose, but to listen. He sat in a dusty courtyard beside a nurse and asked, "What will keep this place alive another week?" That simple question carried more leadership than 1,000 campaign promises. In the silence of that moment, the nation changed. Older generations who had lost hope began to whisper again, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They had seen ambition before, but this was responsibility. And when markets began to reopen, when displaced families started returning home, when salaries were cut at the top so that aid could reach the bottom, elders across the land nodded in solemn agreement. They knew that real power doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Real power works quietly in fields and clinics and empty classrooms. Traoré didn't build a monument. He built momentum. And that's what makes this story different. It's not about one man's rise. It's about a nation remembering what leadership can feel like when it's done with clean hands and clear eyes. So before you scroll away, ask yourself, what kind of leadership would make your grandparents proud? If you've got an answer, share it in the comments, because these are the conversations that keep hope alive. While the world was busy watching headlines, he was changing them, without ever needing to be the headline himself. Instead of making promises, he made decisions. Instead of holding press conferences, he held the hands of grieving mothers. Instead of sitting behind armored glass, he walked in open-air markets. And that's what made the elders begin to believe again. Because they remember a time when leadership meant sacrifice, not selfies. When it meant staying last in line, not first on stage. Captain Traoré's war wasn't only against insurgents, it was against a culture of greed. Against the invisible chains that kept Burkina Faso rich in resources, but poor in returns. While foreign companies smuggled out gold, Traoré signed off on building the country's first national refinery, not in theory, but in cement. And when asked why he wouldn't name it after himself, he answered, "Why should my name be on something the people built?" That line spread like wildfire, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Elders who had watched the country's wealth disappear into foreign vaults finally saw a door opening for their grandchildren. Traoré didn't just bring infrastructure, he brought ownership. Backyards once quiet with resignation now buzzed with possibility. Old men who once cursed every passing election now leaned into radios, hoping for updates, not on politics, but on policy. Hope doesn't need fanfare, it needs proof. And Traoré gave them that with every project finished, every ribbon he refused to cut unless the road was complete, every young farmer he visited without cameras. Old voices started to hum again. Not with praise, but with pride. And maybe that's the difference. Legacy isn't built in marble. It's built in moments ordinary people remember forever. If any moment has ever restored your faith in leadership, write it below. Your comment might give someone else the hope they need to believe again. While others spoke of independence, he acted it. For years, Burkina Faso exported its gold raw, only to buy it back at triple the price. Refineries were always abroad, profits always foreign. Traore looked at that system and called it by its name. Not trade, but theft. So he ordered the construction of a national gold refinery with local labor and public ownership. Elders who had mined that gold with bare hands decades ago watched in quiet awe. Their lives had been spent digging riches they never tasted. Now their grandchildren might finally hold the fruits. And that refinery wasn't just metal and machinery. It was a message that the wealth of the land should serve the people who live on it. And he didn't stop there. He brought solar power to regions that had been in darkness for generations. Over 200,000 people received light, not from promises, but from action. For the old man who had lit his home with kerosene since 1974, that switch was more than electricity. It was dignity. It was being seen after decades of being forgotten. And when Traore announced that citizens could buy shares in the national telecom company, ordinary citizens, not just corporations, it wasn't just economics. It was empowerment that within days over $60 million was raised. Elders who had never owned stock in anything now held pieces of their country. That feeling of not being left behind, of still being part of the story, that's something no speech can give. That's what makes a legacy. Every meter of road paved, every school funded, every hospital stocked, it echoes louder in the heart of a generation that thought their time had passed. But Traore didn't build for applause. He built for memory, and that's why this moment matters. So if you've ever felt forgotten by those in power, know this: leadership is not about age. It's about action. And sometimes the youngest man in the room carries the oldest soul. Not every decision makes headlines, but some decisions change history quietly, like roots growing beneath the surface. When Traore slashed salaries inside his own cabinet, not once but twice, he wasn't punishing politicians. He was making space. Space for hospitals, funding for scholarships, room for dignity to return to public service. Older citizens watched in silence but not indifference. They had lived long enough to see politicians grow richer while their clinics crumbled. Yet, here was a man who ordered luxury budgets frozen, who forced ministers to justify every international flight, who turned excess into access. That wasn't revolution, that was restoration. A return to values that had been buried under decades of corruption and compromise. And the results spoke for themselves. Economic growth surged. National debt dropped by billions. Inflation fell. Every elder who had struggled with bread prices, who had watched their pensions vanish into broken systems, now saw something unimaginable: stability. And stability isn't loud, doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with water in the taps, medicine on the shelves, and silence where there used to be gunfire. It comes when a grandmother can send her granddaughters to school without fear of bombs or kidnappings. It comes when a retired mechanic can fix bikes again on paved roads he once only dreamed of. That's what Traore brought. Not just numbers, but peace of mind. Older generations don't ask for much. Not banners, not slogans, just results. And in the quiet math of the market, in the unseen corners of rural clinics, they saw something they hadn't seen in years: a reason to hope again. If you've ever experienced that quiet peace, the kind that only comes when things finally begin to work, leave a word in the comments below. It might remind someone else that change is still possible, even when it arrives without a drum. He could have had statues built. He could have renamed highways or minted coins with his face, but he chose not to. Because real legacy isn't carved in stone, it's etched in lives. Instead of monuments, he funded women-led agricultural cooperatives in regions once ruled by fear. Instead of launching propaganda, he launched school lunch programs for children whose parents had known only hunger. And he did it all without a media campaign. No weekly addresses, no social media spectacle, just results. Older generations saw that silence and called it strength, because they knew the loudest men often delivered the least. But here was a man who led without posing, who governed without parading, who served without self-praise. In a time where leaders crave attention, Traoré remained quiet. And in that quiet, people found trust. Elders who had stopped voting, stopped hoping, even stopped praying for change, now found themselves watching again, wondering if this time was different. And for once, it was. Traoré wasn't trying to sell an image. He was building a nation. No billboards, no titles, no golden chairs, just a red beret and worn boots. And yet somehow that image inspired more loyalty than any flag. That's the paradox of real power. The less it asks for, the more it earns. And now elders tell stories of him around fires, not because he asked them to, but because he reminded them of values they once believed had died with their generation. Service over luxury, duty over fame, country over self. What do you think is the most powerful symbol of leadership? A crown? A flag? Or maybe just a red beret? Tell us what you believe, because your voice matters more than you know. Some say history is written by the powerful, but in Burkina Faso, elders say history is remembered by the honest. And maybe that's what Traoré gave them, not a new chapter, but a return to the original script. One where dignity was not a decoration, but a duty, where power meant protection, not privilege. In his quiet defiance, he didn't just challenge the world's expectations. He rewrote his people's belief in themselves. Every time he refused to be celebrated, they celebrated him more. Not for who he was, but for what he stood for. And in a world where leaders often outlive their legacies, his was already planted in the soil. In the solar panels lighting old homes, in the school books delivered to forgotten towns, in the gold refineries run by local hands. That's what made the elders smile, not because they were promised change, but because they could see it. And as the dust settled over the months and years, as headlines faded and the cameras left, one thing remained, the feeling that for once someone had walked among them not to be remembered, but to make them unforgettable. An old woman in Kaya was asked once what she thought of him. She didn't speak in slogans. She simply said, "He eats after the children have eaten." That one line, spoken softly, held centuries of pain and the quiet healing of finally being seen. Traoré may not lead forever. He may not be perfect. No one is. But in the eyes of those who had long lost faith, he gave them something rare, the belief that not all who lead must take, that some, in fact, are here to give. So as you close this video, carry this with you, not just the story of a man, but the memory of a moment when silence spoke louder than speeches, when service meant more than ceremony, when leadership looked like sacrifice. If you've ever seen leadership that made you believe again, share it below. Because the more we remember those moments, the harder they become to erase. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's how change really begins.